welcome back to part 2 of our soil sample reading. In that first video, we talked about organic matter, pH, how the base saturations make up the pH, and really the ideal percentages of base saturation. So for each cation, and really those are the building blocks of the soil. That's what determines your how balanced your soil is, really how high of a level your soil can function as far as nutrient availability. So with that, I wanted to go in a little bit deeper into the soil sample and really I guess really kind of provide some insight on some of the recommendations that we might make when reading a soil sample.
So we got through the bones of a reading the basics of a soil sample and the first things you need to look at. So here we got a Mehlich 3 soil test. So we're going to get into the meat and the potatoes here now, and I'm going to quiz Paul a little bit. This is a client of his, so we're going to pick his brain a little bit and see what he's looking at with this. So kind of what we first talked about. So the basis of this soil sample, what exactly did we do, or what exactly did you do, and what was kind of the goal in mind with this sample?
Yeah, so this soil analysis report actually represents a few different fields and a couple different zones within each of those fields. So when I first looked at this, I saw there was really one field where both zone A and B were higher in pH, and we saw that was because we had excess calcium there. You see our base saturations are, above 70% calcium, and so that's kind of driving our pH up. I looked at our organic matter and our CEC. We actually have good holding capacity in this soil with a 20 CEC, and we can rely on about 35 pounds of nitrogen being mineralized throughout a year, provided we have adequate moisture. So with the organic matter, at that 1.7, I can count on about 35 pounds of nitrogen, provided we have good moisture being mineralized. So with that, kind of the next thing I'm going to look at is P and K. The next two high, pounds of uptake for a corn or a wheat crop. Typically is what we're dealing with in our area. So this is a dryland farm. So looking at the parts per million for Mehlich 3 for phosphorus, we see we have 71 on one zone and an 85 on that next zone for the field A. And really for a dryland crop, if we're shooting for about 100 bushel dryland corn or maybe 80 bushel dryland wheat, then we have a fair amount of phos out here. Really, that's what I would consider a sufficient amount with the Mehlich 3 sample.
So okay, so before you keep going, so when you see that, okay, we got this range. I mean, we have a zone that has 28, and so but you also look to the column to the left of it. I mean, we got 1.1 organic matter, and then we go down. They're not 100% correlated, but I mean we range from 28 to 222. So I mean, when you see that, what are you looking at, or what are you trying to do with those phos levels? I mean, are you trying to address that 28? I mean, which numbers are you looking at, or what would you recommend on the phos when you have a situation like that?
Yeah, a lot of times it's actually pretty common that we'll see our phosphorus vary like that when it's built up from a history of manure or a history of like banded 1034 or 1152 applications. A lot of times you do see that variability. The other thing that I think is important to point out here too is that, um, on a Malik 3 sample and how that would convert, if we were doing a Bray 1 and a Bray 2, is that a Malik 3 is really saying best case scenario, this is all the phos you have available. So a 28 parts per million is low for a Malik 3 extraction method. So on that field, it tells you a little bit about the history that we have that much variability, in that particular field, or 28 to 91 are our phosphorus levels. So and we know in that one zone we've got lower organic matter soils, we've got slightly lower pH, but the biggest thing is that we can see our cation exchange capacity is lower there too. So we know we're dealing with a most likely a hilltop or a sandier knob in this field. So a lot of that phos, which I mean, I've heard a lot of people say phosphorus really doesn't move in the soil, but we actually set up some drain gauges years ago and did some studies on that. And in the sand, phosphorus does actually move through our profile. Not very typical. It's not very typical in dryland scenario, because we don't get a lot of flushing rains. But in this instance, it's probably more of an application. That caused, whether it was, the spreader, under applied in that spot where this field had manure, it's probably why we're seeing that variability. So what I would like to do in this field is, if I'm confident in these zones, and I feel like the zones are a good representation of the variability throughout the field, I would go out and probably variable rate some phosphorus, and really depending on whether or not that farmer wants to build soil test P levels or if he just wants to apply crop sufficiency for that current year.
It's time for a crop nutrition plan that gets more return from every drop. Starting with Pro Germinator from AgroLiquid, a complete phosphorus fertilizer product that includes nitrogen, potassium, and iron. More than 30 years of research shows that lower application rates of Pro Germinator often outperform other sources of fertilizer. With AgroLiquid's Pro Germinator, you can apply less and expect more. Find out more at agroliquid.com.
The other thing that's important, I think, for farmers to understand is we need to get out of the mindset that the primary nutrients, NPK, are more important than the secondary and micronutrients. It's not that they're more important, it's just that they're called primary because they're needed in larger quantities. So your secondary nutrients like sulfur are just as important. They just require less pounds. There's less, the plant needs less pounds to actually build whatever kind of grain you're building, wheat or corn or milo. That that nutrient's still important. So we don't want to overlook, all these micronutrients and the secondary nutrients because we think all that matters is NPK. We've learned way too much, over the last 20 years in agriculture to, in my opinion, kind of revert back to the way, Grandpa always used to do it, 20, 40 years ago, whatever that is, maybe 60 years ago. And that was just apply some nitrogen. So there really is a lot of importance to the secondary nutrients and these micronutrients.
What sticks out to you the most? Either levels, ratios, the variance between them, anything. As if you're looking at this for the first time, what comes across your mind when you first read this between those five?
Yeah, so usually the first nutrient or micronutrient I look at here is going to be crop dependent. So if we're raising corn, it's going to be zinc. Now, if I know we're going to wheat, then it's going to be manganese and iron. because those are wheat is actually going to like manganese and iron more than corn. So it really depends on the crop. But let's say it's going to be corn, and I'm looking at zinc, and I see that we have 1.4 parts per million on that very top sample in a Malic 3. That there is a ratio, and again, it's been thrown out a lot over the last few years, but it's that P-to-zinc ratio. Okay, can we have that 10-to-1 ratio? Okay, so if we have 71 parts per million of phosphorus, then we would technically want to have the well balanced, soil where we get the best efficiency from our phosphorus and our zinc. We would be at about 7 parts per million zinc. Okay, so now I'm going to step back and say, okay, is that economical to add 5.6 pound or parts per million? So it'd be double that in pounds per acre of zinc just to have that 10-to-1 ratio
Of actual.
Yeah, of actual. Yep, absolutely. So that's when I'm going to look at it and say, okay, it's probably not economical for me to build up my zinc soil levels that high. And honestly, with zinc, it's going to take a couple years. Zinc takes a little bit. Even if you do a liquid application of zinc, it's going to take a little bit to react and actually show up on a soil sample. So with that in mind, my ratio of that 10-to-1 P to zinc ratio is kind of secondary. Like, I really just want to make sure we have enough zinc so that crop's never pulling back yield because we have a zinc deficiency. That's going to be my first concern. So really, even if you're growing 100 bushel dryland corn, or let's say 250 irrigated corn, you're not removing a lot of pounds. Okay, so we actually have sufficient zinc in this scenario. The problem is, in my opinion, is that Malic 3 extraction. Okay, and this is especially in higher pH soils like those top two samples. This is where I kind of like the DTPA extraction for the micronutrients, because it's not as generous on, it's not as generous as far as how many pounds it's going to say you have available per acre. And I feel like in our soils, a lot of times if we're dry, we are going to have a harder time getting zinc into the plant. Or if and this is actually a kind of a textbook example. If our phosphorus is 3 to 4 times that 10-to-1 ratio, then we're going to have a harder time getting zinc into that plant. I think for zinc, it's a good rule of thumb for corn to put out a little bit in furrow. We've seen it over 5 years of trials now, where a balanced micronutrient pack where we've got a little bit of zinc, manganese, and iron, and a little bit of copper and boron as well, but just very trace amounts. That is the one of the best responses we've gotten in corn, is just making sure we have that plant available form of those micronutrients right there where the plant's going to uptake it, right in furrow. And that's been one of our not only largest ROIs, but one of the most consistent ROIs we've had.
Yeah, I would agree. Like you said, a lot of people focus on the N, P, and K, and that's the main reason why they're, maybe not the main reason, but a big reason why they're putting out manure, a lot of tons of manure. They're building up those P levels, but then you forget about those micros, and that's not necessarily a yield drag, but they're limiting themselves. So a simple fix, you spend a little money on some chelated micronutrients, and you get a good return. Even though your N, P, and K levels are pretty good, you're still holding yourself back a little bit.
NextGen Fertilizers is introducing SeedLink, the game-changing planter box product that's revolutionizing corn planter box products. SeedLink delivers uniform emergence like never before, so every seed gets the perfect start. It's packed with phosphorus, humic and fulvic acids, amino acids, and beneficial biology. And the best part, SeedLink is half the cost of most of the other competitive products, even with more in it. We're not just applying biology here, we're actually applying biology with a food source. Use SeedLink on your corn today and get better emergence, better results, and all for a better price. I mean, if we're looking at wheat, I go over here and like I said earlier, I'm really going to look at that. I'm going to look at zinc too, but I'm also going to look at the manganese and iron, specifically for wheat. Also important in corn. But I know wheat's going to give me a bigger response if I, need to have an application with manganese or iron in most scenarios. So as I'm looking at those, that manganese parts per million, again, this is where it goes back to extraction method. If this were a DTPA, we would, likely on, you do the conversions, you'd likely be, kind of in that medium range of plant available manganese, and probably wouldn't recommend an application at 150, parts per million of manganese.
We're really on that borderline. The top two are on the borderline. The other ones are definitely below.
Right. And again, that's why it's so important to understand the extraction method and what it means. So what Malic 3 does is, and again, let's just take that very top soil sample, and remember, we've got a 7.6 pH, and that is going to greatly influence the manganese availability. Malic 3 is a super strong acid, and we're going to be adding that acid to our soils, and it's going to give us the highest amount of parts per million of any other extraction method. Okay, which is great if you just want high soil test levels, but it might not be great if you truly want to find, okay, is there a positive ROI in a manganese application? Because if I just looked at this, most farmers are going to see 152 parts per million. Well, that's all the manganese I'll ever need. Like, that's a lot. I do not need to apply manganese. But if you do a DTPA test, a lot of times you'll see, okay, that one's lower because my pH is 7.6. Okay, and maybe this third sample where it's lower in parts per million on a Malic 3, maybe it's actually, not half of those first two samples. Maybe it's closer to 2/3 of those first two samples, because that pH is accounted for better in a DTPA extraction method. So, especially in our arid climate. So with manganese, we're really looking at, okay, what's the crop need? Manganese is somewhat leachable, not as much as nitrogen, sulfur, and boron, but it's kind of, right below those as far as leachability. And so I'm looking at this and saying, okay, let's say I'm trying to raise 250 bushel corn. I only need like 0.4 pounds of manganese, to make that crop. I'm probably just going to apply that 0.4 pounds of manganese, if we're borderline at all. I really haven't seen any soil tests in our area show up high in manganese. Or iron, for that matter, or copper or boron. Really, if we're high in something, a lot of times it's zinc. And why do you think that is? Because we've applied zinc for the last 40 years, because that's what the co-op salesman said to do. What do we need to do on this soil? Oh, I think 20 gallons of 1034 and 2 quarts of zinc.
Yeah. Yeah, the tried and true method.
So I know, and it shows, because, we did hundreds of tissue samples across a 4-state area, sent them in weekly tissue samples by growth stage, based on not just the lab saying sufficient, not an average amount of you know, really when the lab says sufficient or deficient on a tissue sample, they're just saying it's higher or lower than the average of what the samples they get sent in at. That's not what we were doing. We were actually correlating it to a yield goal. Okay, so if, for instance, if we had a 260 bushel yield goal on corn, we would need to be at a certain percentage for, you know, at each growth stage, versus if we were only shooting for 220 bushel corn, could we be a little bit lower? And what we saw is that we could actually be a little bit lower in our tissue samples and still reach that lower yield goal. So the fact that they're related to a yield goal makes a big difference versus just what the lab is saying. Okay, you're above average or you're below average.
Yeah, that's a good point, because even you go 220 bushel corn to 250, there's pretty big differences in the tissue sample targets, let alone 200 to 300. So yeah, that's a good point to remember, is what metrics the labs are using, because like you said, it's just an average of everything they get, and it depends on who's been sending them in and what type of what type, or the quality of corn that's been sent in, because a lot of times people send in samples when they think there's issues. So if your corn's looking decent, yeah, it's probably going to show sufficient, but is it really sufficient for the yield goal you're looking for? Well, you have to dive into that and really keep track of that, or else you really don't know. And until you do your own, you have to set your own standards, and it does take research and time, but it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good way to look at it is, you know, if you see a, you know, your neighbor's corn's never as good as yours, right?
Yeah.
So you see your neighbor's shitty corn and you're like, well, that's what your sample is being compared to.
Yeah.
So if theirs is, let's say, for instance, on manganese, let's say it's, you know, on a tissue sample, you know, 20 parts per million, and yours comes back as 30 part per million, then all of a sudden you're high. You've got plenty of manganese. But what if the crop actually needs to be at 40 parts per million?
Right.
You know, so it's really standardized by that yield goal, is very important. So back to what I was going to say on as far as what we've seen with the micronutrients and tissue samples, is that our over 5 years, hundreds of soil samples per year, a wide variety of irrigated and dry land of, you know, multiple states. So a very good pool of data that we're pulling from here. And we learned that about 60% of our tissue samples in corn from V3 to R1 were deficient in manganese. It was our number one nutrient that we were deficient in our tissue samples, even over nitrogen. And that's what a lot of people thought, that, you know, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to increase my nitrogen use efficiency, or, you know, I'm going to be able to save money on nitrogen by pulling tissue samples. It's like, well, maybe you are and maybe you aren't, but at the end of the day, what we learned is that, you know, less than 5% of our tissue samples were deficient for their yield goal in nitrogen because we apply it. Okay. A lot of farmers in our area do not apply manganese and iron and copper, and those were the things that were showing up, I mean, over half the time. And it regardless of growth stage, and a lot of times it was consecutive weeks of this crop is being told that it needs to pull back bushels because it doesn't have enough of a micronutrient. Okay, so that's very important to realize. You know, again, they're not, just because they're micros, just because they're needed in smaller amounts, does not make them less important.